Once again, we're returning to the Besorah studies, that is, the Gospels, the Hebraic understanding. So we're taking up the story, this time in part 11. Earlier this year, I did the first 10-part videos, which saw Yeshua going through the first stages or first phases of his earthly ministry. And today we take up the story again in the second part. So we begin looking at the second phase of Yeshua's outreach in the northern part of Galilee. During the first phase, he spent most of his time around the southern parts of Galilee. And now we're focusing our attention towards the areas of the north. However, before starting to follow his footsteps northward, I want to briefly recap on past events. We know from the narratives of the Gospels that the time between his immersion and his execution was around 18 months, with every likelihood that he was immersed shortly after Yochanan the Immerser, or John the Baptist, began immersing people immediately before the fall festivals of 28 CE. After his 40 days in the wilderness, Yeshua returned to Nazareth, and he remained there until he turned water into wine about 2 weeks before Pesach in 29 CE. A few days after his first miracle, he and his family and friends all went to Jerusalem, or Jerusalem, which was the custom. All Jewish men had to appear in Jerusalem 3 times each year in accordance with Torah. Having overturned the merchants' tables while he was in the temple courts, he was challenged by the Judean authorities and was chased out of town shortly after the week of Matzah had ended. He returned to the Galilee through the area of Shomron, where he met the woman at the well. And for the next 45 days, he was teaching and healing all around Capernaum, where he had many heated exchanges with the Perishim, or Pharisees, and the Torah teachers, who challenged him constantly to admit that he was the Mashiach, the Messiah. Finally, that first phase of his ministry ended with him selecting his 12 emissaries from among the crowd of faithful followers. That first phase ended with him heading back to Jerusalem for the celebration of Shavuot, where, on the Shabbat, he healed the man who'd been crippled for 38 years. But once again, of course, he was rebuked and challenged by the Judean authorities, and quickly departed up the eastern side of the Jordan River, and returned to Capernaum, along with his 12 emissaries. That brings us to the start of his second phase of his ministry, which involves, of course, him sharing the good news to the northern parts of Galilee. Now, looking back to the time when he selected his 12 emissaries, Luke says in chapter 6, verse 17, that when he announced his selection, a large crowd of people were gathering around him from Yehuda, Jerusalem, and the coastlands, including Zor and Sidon. They had come to hear and to be healed by him of all their diseases. Luke continues in verses 20 and 21. Yeshua looked at his Talmidim and said, "How blessed are the poor, for the kingdom of God is theirs. How blessed are you who are hungry, for you will be filled. How blessed are you who are crying now, for you will laugh." It is important that Luke mentions that people had come from the coastlands around the area of Zor and Sidon, which were the 2 towns where Yeshua visits in his second phase of his Galilee ministry. And many people from Yehuda and Jerusalem had already escaped the tyranny of Herod the Great and his son Archelaus. Now, back in the time when Joseph and Miriam had taken Yeshua as a baby to live in Nazareth, many others had also departed from from Yehuda because of the tyranny of Archelaus. So Yeshua was deeply moved by the plight of those people. That is why he spoke about the poor, the hungry, and those crying in anguish. Now they were part of the third tier of people, bearing in mind that the Romans were the overlords, and then we had the king, Herod, Antipas at that stage. They were the second tier, and then the common people, the peasants, the farmers, the carpenters and fishermen were all part of that third tier, which is who are the people that Yeshua was actually reaching out to on his travels northward during that second phase of his ministry. That is why he spoke about how the 12 emissaries would be sent out, of course, to the lost sheep of Israel. Before Yeshua set out on his northern journey, he dispatched those 12 on their first healing and teaching mission. Turning back to Matthew chapter 10, we see that there was a lengthy instruction on what was expected of them and how they were to go out looking for the lost sheep of Israel. They were not to go to Shomron, and they were not to go to the Goyim, or the Gentiles. None of the Gospels give us any clue as to where those emissaries went. All Luke says in chapter 9 verse 6 is that they set out and went from village to village, healing and announcing the good news everywhere. Then in verse 10 he continues, on their return the emissaries detailed to Yeshua what they had done. It appears that the emissaries may well have gone to Beit Zayada, which of course was the hometown of Kepha, Andrew and Philip. It makes perfect sense that they of course would start in their own hometown. But it appears that they were rejected by the townsfolk, just as Yeshua had warned would happen. After all, even he earlier had been rejected by the people of Nazareth when he went to his own hometown, where he was teaching about the ways of Yahweh in ways that they did not want to hear. In response, Yeshua said in Luke chapter 10 verses 13 and 14, woe to you, Chorazin, and woe to you, Beit Zayada, for if a miracle had been done in Zior or Sidon, they would have long ago have put on sackcloth and ashes as evidence that they had changed their ways. Matthew repeats the same condemnation for those two towns and goes further by saying in Matthew 11:23 and 24, you, Capernaum, will you be exalted to heaven? No, you will be brought down to Sheol. That is quoting from Isaiah 14, which we read this morning. If the miracles done in you had been done in Sodom, it would still be in existence today. But I tell you that on the day of judgment, it will be more bearable for the land of Sodom than it is for you. Yeshua did not mince his words when he spoke this way about these towns, the ones who had rejected his message and that of the 12. He showed complete contempt for those towns. Just as we read in Yeshayahu or Isaiah chapter 14, it will be the adversary, the one who brings pain and suffering upon not only Israel, but also the common people of many nations. He is the one who will be completely destroyed, and all who stand with the adversary will also perish. Having launched his emissaries into the surrounding towns, Yeshua realized that they had a great deal to learn before they could boldly go forth to beyond the confines of Yehuda and Galilee. Now, staying with Luke, we see in chapter 7, verses 11 through 17, the very next day he departed from Capernaum and travelled southward to Nahum, a small town near Nazareth. While in Nahum, a young man was being prepared for burial. Feeling compassion for the boy's mother, Yeshua told the young man, "Get up," with which he sat up and began to speak. Once again, the crowd were filled with awe and proclaimed, "A great prophet has been amongst us, and God has come to help his people." It appears that, after leaving Nahum, Yeshua and the 12 headed north or westward out to the coastal region on his way to Zior and Zidon. There he found a house to stay. Was it possible that he wanted some downtime? To be alone with his newly selected emissaries? What better place to go to than an area outside the normal limits of the Galilee? He wanted to remain unrecognized. Yet, as we saw earlier, when he nominated those 12 men as emissaries, there were many people present from the whole coastal region, including Zior and Zidon. So having found a house in which to stay, it was only a matter of time, of course, before somebody would find him. And sure, the very next verse, a woman whose daughter had an unclean spirit finds him and falls at his feet. Yeshua started by rejecting the approaches of the woman and took pity on her, even though she was a Greek. Finally, he sends her away home to find that the demon had left the daughter. Once again, with his cover blown, he had to move on to yet another town. So leaving Zior, he headed further north to Zidon. When we consider the boundaries of the land of Canaan, which Yahweh had given or promised to Israel, we see that the northwestern boundary on the coast was Zidon, as defined in Bereshit, or Genesis chapter 10, verse 19. The western boundary was the Mediterranean coast, all the way down to El Arish, which is the modern location of the Wadi of Egypt. And that is the southwestern point that was promised to Abraham. So that it's significant that Yeshua would spend time in both Zior and Zidon, because in the earlier part of Ezekiel chapter 28, Yahweh Elohim speaks about the arrogance of both the king and the prince of Zior. As Zior was well inside the territory that Yahweh had promised to Abraham, it is the same territory that presently is owned or occupied by Lebanon. So the ultimate outcome of the cross-border battles between Israel and Hezbollah will finally be brought to an end once I have shown my holiness to them as the Goyim watch. Then they, Israel, will live in their own land, which I gave to my servant Yaakov. In the same way, the nations will finally succumb to the will of Yahweh. As we read in Yeshayahu, Isaiah, I will rise up against them, says Yahweh Zebaot. I will cut them off, says Yahweh. I will make it a haunt for hedgehogs, and it will become a swampy waste, says Yahweh. These words are confirmed also in Revelation chapter 17, where Baal the Great is finally destroyed in verse 17, where it says, for God put it in their hearts to do what will fulfill his purpose. That is, to be of one mind, to give their kingdom to the beast until God's words have been accomplished. That is how the whole despicable situation in Israel will finally ultimately end. But we as Talmudim of Yeshua have to wait patiently for his promised return, when things that have been prophesied will of course be brought to fruition. So moving on, Yeshua departed from Zidon, crossed the country to Caesarea Philippi. So why did Yeshua choose to go to Philippi? Sidon is the northwest boundary of the territory of Canaan. Likewise, Mount Hermon, which is just northeast of Caesarea Philippi, it is the northeastern boundary of the land of Canaan. Therefore, it appears that Yeshua, like his forefather Abraham, was staking out his claim to the territory promised would become the permanent inheritance of his chosen people Israel. By taking his 12 emissaries to those chosen places, he was paving the way for the final takeover of the land from the clutches of the adversary Satan, who of course is still claiming territorial rights of the region of Israel. Many portions of the southern part of Lebanon truly belong to Israel. Currently, all three locations, Zior, Sidon, and Mount Hermon, are still under the control of Lebanon and Hezbollah. Another important feature of his time in Caesarea Philippi is that Yeshua, when alone, asked the 12 of them, "Who are people saying I am?" In Luke chapter 9, verses 19 through 22, the emissaries responded by saying, "Yochanan the Immerser, but others say it's Elijah. Others say a prophet from long ago has arisen." Then he turns to them and said, "But you, who do you say I am?" Kepha answered, "The Mashiach of God." Shimon bar Yochanan, how blessed are you, for no human being has ever revealed this to you. No, it was from the Father in heaven. Well, I also tell you this, you, Kepha, which means rock, you will be the one on whom the community will be built, and you will be given the keys to the kingdom. Now those are powerful words that Yeshua spoke to Kepha, and through those same words he was establishing what would become the first century Messianic community. As Yeshua said those words to Kepha, and as Kepha would lead the community forward after Yeshua had ascended to the last time, that appointment was fulfilled in Acts chapter 2, when Kepha spoke out about Yeshua after the Ruach came down as tongues of fire. Turning back to Mark in chapter 9, verses 2 and 3, we're told that Yeshua took Kepha, Yochanan, and Yaakov and led them up the high mountain privately. That high mountain, of course, was Mount Hermon, where Yeshua was confirming his messiahship. He was seen in the presence of Moshe and Eliyahu in the Transfiguration. During that Transfiguration, a cloud enveloped all three, and the voice came forward from that cloud, "This is my son, whom I love. Listen to him." Then suddenly, when they looked, they saw no one except Yeshua. Then, as we read earlier in Matthew chapter 17, Yeshua taught them all about how Eliyahu had been seen in the Transfiguration would appear at the fullness of time. But he already had appeared, of course, in their lifetime in the form of Yochanan the Immerser. He also warned them not to speak of those things until after he'd been raised from death. Only 3 of those emissaries actually went up on the mountain with him to witness that Transfiguration. With those 3, Yeshua had laid the foundations for what lay ahead. However, none of the 12 really grasped the full significance of just what had occurred, nor what Yeshua meant when he spoke about his pending death and resurrection. However, having laid the foundations for the Messianic community, Yeshua and the 12 returned to Capernaum. On the journey, the 12 began arguing among themselves, who's going to be the greatest? Well, he sat down and summoned the 12 and said to them, "If anyone wants to be first, make himself last as a servant of all." The 3, Kepha, Yochanan, and Yaakov, who had witnessed the Transfiguration, had doubtless been sharing their experience with the other 9. So human nature had kicked in, and the 12 began to challenge over the leadership. Now, why had Yeshua chosen just 3 to see the Transfiguration? Why not all 12? There is no answer given. but it certainly paves the way for dispute among his Talmudim. As we don't know why he made that selection, it does indicate that he will choose whomever he wants for specific tasks, and it is not for us to question why. We will leave Yeshua and his emissaries there in Capernaum at this stage and consider the remainder of his ministry in the northern part of Galilee in session 12 next week. During that session, we will see how Yeshua once again will finally head to Jerusalem for the observance of Hoshana Rabbah, or the 7th day of Sukkot, in the year 29 CE. Shabbat Shalom.